And of course nowadays it's a dinosaur turning into a bird, so instead of KFC it's KFD, I guess. But here's another experiment you can do. I mean, those of you who have children, do you have to tell your children to mess their rooms up? Well, I ask this because the evolutionists try and say that all you need to make order is a flow of energy. Well, the children are bundles of energy. If you let them go to it, they're going to make more mess, though, aren't they? If you want them to tidy the room up, you have to tell them to do it. They have to use organisation. See, organisation requires an organiser. To give you an example of what we're up about, let's put this frog in a blender. See, the blender's pure energy, isn't it? And what happens, you flick the switch and it goes, and you get frog soup. So why did the frog die here? Because it was disorganized. And you realize, you think, if I left this for millions of years and zapped with any sort of energy you like, ultraviolet, heat, gamma rays, X-rays, shook it up, do you think a frog's going to hop out of there again? Well, okay, why not? All the chemicals are there, all the components of the frog are still there. The point is, they've been disorganized and are not going to organize themselves. And in fact, in this frog soup, you've got far more chemicals than any primordial soup could ever have. Because you've got lots of the proteins, the DNA is there. So the primordial soup that I'll show you will never get proteins or DNA. So this is far richer than any primordial soup, and yet no living thing is going to grow out of there. And in fact, also, whenever you eat canned food, you are showing that the chemical evolution idea is just not possible, because the point of canning food is you sterilize it and seal it, and the point is no germ is going to generate in there. And in fact, if it becomes contaminated, you know very well the seal's got broken somehow, because you know very well that no bacterium, no germ is going to generate in a can of sardines, even though, again, a can of sardines is far richer than any primordial soup could ever be. And yet no germ will ever grow in there. And you've got billions of cans of food around the world, and so every time you open those and find it's not contaminated, you're disproving the evolutionary idea of origin of life from non-living chemicals. Now, what do you actually need to get a simple cell? It's pretty important to see what even a so-called simple cell must have. It must be able to reproduce itself, and by reproduction it means making a copy of itself. Now, think about trying to make a machine that could make a copy of itself. See, we can't even do that. So we can make a factory to make machines, but you can't make a factory to make another factory that will make the same things. So a self-replicating machine is incredibly complicated. And it must be able to transmit oodles of information down to the next generation. Now, this is important for natural selection. See, natural selection, I think Dr. Batten will be covering natural selection in one of his talks. And the point about natural selection is that certain information that codes for a characteristic which is useful for a living, like maybe stronger muscle or better or faster running, and that gets passed on to the next generation. So you have to have reproduction before natural selection can work. But therefore, if you haven't got a living cell in the first place, you can't use natural selection to explain it. You need the living cell before natural selection can work. So to produce the first cell, you haven't got natural selection, you've only got time and chance. There's also the requirement of metabolism, because all the cell processes use energy. You've got to get energy from somewhere. So you've got metabolism and reproduction. Both of those are required for living cells. Now, we've actually got examples of very so-called simple cells. There's a parasite called Mycoplasma. It can cause horrible things like pneumonia, for instance. They're nasty things, but they're the tiniest real self-reproducing life known. You see, a virus isn't really self-reproducing. A virus needs to hijack the machinery of more complicated cells to reproduce. It doesn't reproduce by itself. So a mycoplasma is the simplest thing that can make copies of itself. And yet it has 482 genes. Or, as we'll go on to show, 580,000 DNA letters, as it were. That's an awful lot of information, even for a so-called simple cell, And yet, it's not really complicated enough. It can't survive by itself. It has to be a parasite to more complex machinery, more complex living things. Because there's certain things it can't get by itself. And in fact, on our website, we've got an article showing that possibly the mycoplasma and other parasites have become a result of loss of information to do the things it used to be able to do by itself. Now it needs other living things to do it for it, which is why it has to become a parasite. So before the fall, probably this thing was not a parasite. But after the fall, it deteriorated to such an extent that it needed to become a parasite. Now, some researchers, one of them is called Craig Venter, they're trying to design life from scratch. Well, not really from scratch, really trying to design it based on already known living things and seeing how many genes they could take out for the thing to still survive. And they estimate that they could possibly get down to 256 genes. Well, that's a pretty large amount. And they're very doubtful this thing would actually be able to survive because it's so depleted in information, it probably couldn't make a lot of the important things it needs. Now let's look at the cell and try and magnify what we need a bit. So here's an example of the cell, a lot of different components of the cell. Now when you try and break it down, which I'll try and do now, the cell is made of very big molecules. So you go down one level, magnify it a bit, and you find cells made of very big molecules called DNA and other big molecules called proteins. Now let's magnify this a bit more, and the big molecules are made of units of little molecules. So the DNA and protein are made of littler molecules. Combined, billions of little molecules are combined to make DNA. So there's a big problem trying to get from little molecules into big molecules, and then from the big molecules to organize into a cell. And here's what Michael Denton says about the cell. He's not even a creationist, but he wrote in the book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. I believe AIG still stocks this book, and he says to grasp the reality of life as it's been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it's 20 kilometers in diameter and resembles a giant airship. And what we'll see then is an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. A world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. Now, it's interesting that the ardent atheist Richard Dawkins says that the point of evolution is to produce objects which have the appearance of being designed. He's an atheist, he doesn't believe they were designed, but he says they have the appearance of being designed. Well, I'd say they look like they've been designed because they have been designed. That's pretty logical. Now, what I said about metabolism, one thing you need for the living cell is an energy source. Now, in the body we have an energy source called ATP.